Hello and welcome to the Echo Chamber podcast. My name is Tony Groves and today is a bit of a milestone for us for a few reasons, but more on that later. As always, I'm joined by my co-host and the only man I know who thought gender fluid was a new type of fancy gin, Martin McMahon. More importantly, and this is the milestone, we're delighted to be joined in the Tortoise Shack by co-leader of the Social Democrats and TD for North Kildare, Catherine Murphy. Catherine, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, and you are actually our 50th guest that we've had in the pod.
Oh yeah, that's celebration.
We didn't say it to you beforehand, but it was kind of a bit of a coup for us. I mean, yes. so look, delighted that you came in. It's great to see you, and again, thanks so much for making the effort to come and join us all the way over in leafy Glasnevin.
Well, thanks very much for the invite, and obviously following what you've been doing, and obviously now that you've got to the 50th, it's well established, and I think that people know where to find you now. We're delighted with that, and it is like literally a little bit of moment of pride there. It doesn't hurt that when myself and Martin a few months ago, we literally were shouting at an iPad, and here we are now with the co-leader of the Social Democrats sitting in the little office. So it's wonderful stuff. But we're going to jump in, and I'm gonna ask. You have had, let's just say, a long developing story, a longer story in the background in terms of IBRC, Siteserv, and what's going on in the background there. But what we've seen most recently in the INM leaks, the data breach, there has to be serious questions asked, I suppose, that in a situation where Leslie Buckley was effectively on the board of INM, he resigns a few months ago, and this breach is then made public, and in the meantime the Data Protection Commissioner goes and attends a INM sponsored event to speak about data protection and the new requirements. I mean, I thought it was like an episode of Black Mirror. Yeah, I thought that showed very, very poor judgment, and I think the importance of data protection is, I think it's coming home to people. We've seen a number of different very high profile things, like, for example, the Facebook thing that's very much in the news this week. And I think people understand that data is of, it's of serious, it's seriously important that it's protected. And I just thought the judgment was terrible on it. Having said that, I've written to the Data Commissioner myself only in the last week, looking for her to investigate a breach in IBRC, that we do require that office to be really, tip-top and above reproach.
Caesar's wife must be beyond, it must be above reproach. You can't have a data protection commissioner just actually exposing themselves to just the idea of bias. The idea of bias is sometimes just a problem. And I have a real problem because I know the Data Protection Act, I know how it works. I'm in financial services. If a laptop goes missing, oh my God, we all lose our minds. We're talking about servers being removed from and given to a third party.
The jurisdiction, it's quite incredible. I mean, obviously that's going to be coming up in the courts, and it seems to be a sizable affidavit that has been, lodged with the courts. Should see that in the coming week. And obviously it's a developing story. And it's a real problem for people who are, working as journalists in the like of INM. I would certainly think twice about emails now.
If you were, it's a worry for journalists who are using emails, but if you're a journalist and you have sources and you're in correspondence with them, the sources are actually exposed here. People who've taken chances with their livelihoods as whistleblowers can be exposed. We know how this country treats whistleblowers, and it's not a...
No, it's not. And the thing about it, and we've seen really good people that have been, that have come out the wrong side of it, like consistently. And we've got to value whistleblowers. The one thing that a journalist will always require is trust. In fact, it's exactly the same thing that I think a public representative requires. You require sometimes to be the person who, says something for somebody who can't say it.
Well, you have the agency. They don't have agency, so you have the agency. And it's the same with journalists. People, when they have something to tell, who do you tell? It's either a politician or a journalist or both, if you can possibly manage it.
Now, I've had people who would have contacted me and said, look, could you recommend a journalist? You know, and you'll be very careful about that, you know, to get the right fit with somebody who has really a story to tell. Sometimes it's on a very personal thing, and it needs to be told sensitively, or, you know, it could be where there's a piece of very hard information that is in the public interest to be put in the public arena. And you're looking at people who are, you know, who are trying to,
Well, if someone's trying to put their story forward, if someone wants to actually get a platform, okay, if you want to actually get your voice heard in this country, it is difficult because it's a quite small, the media is quite small. There's two houses. There's the national broadcaster, and then there's effectively INM, Communicore, the Irish Times, okay? And we have the Irish Times not allowed to speak on Communicore programs at the moment. Yeah. And we have, like, I thought a few weeks ago when they had someone from the Irish Examiner to come in to talk to someone on News Talk about a story written in the Irish Times, just said everything that was dysfunctional
Well, I mean, the dominance, I mean, I introduced a bill last year, Social Democrat bill, and it was in relation to media ownership. And it's quite instructive to see just exactly how the section in our constitution dealing with property, has really tentacles everywhere. And that was one particular reason why it wasn't supported.
So they used the idea that almost as in media was also the equivalent of bricks and mortar, because and to say that we can't meddle in media plurality or diversity.
Yeah, essentially it's the ownership of obviously the various entities. Essentially rowing that back in the context of the fact that we've, as you say, we've got RTE on one side, and obviously that's the national broadcaster, and then you've got the collection on the other side, and that looked like that was even going to grow with the Celtic media.
Almost did.
Yeah, and essentially that shows you something that, I mean, we have a lot of titles that are struggling at the moment, and particularly small rural titles that are very valuable as a community consolidator almost. And essentially it's only people with deep pockets that can really save the industry. This aspect of the industry. Then is it down to who has the deep pockets, or is it, then is it a question then that the less important thing of the two is media plurality, and that can't be the case.
Oh, we've seen recently, and I'm sorry, I giggled as I was going to say this. We've seen recently that fake news and Ireland, the Irish government has selected for want, and this is my words that I use, Dinibot Media to oversee fake news in the EU, and I think this is beyond crazy. It's beyond crazy, but the EU has allowed it.
Yeah, one of the things I was concerned about that, and I made some inquiries on it, is that it's supposed to, any nominee is supposed to come through the public appointments process, and it didn't. And the thing about it is that you can't have that as an a la carte approach. It's either that's the rule or it's not the rule.
And we saw this with Joan Burton when she appointed David Begg. We saw this. If there's a process there, you must use the process. Now, I know they got away with that by saying best person for the job and all of this, but we don't know that any of this is
true.
Can
I come in on that? And again, going back to the same line of Caesar's wife must be beyond reproach. A few weeks before that, our Taoiseach met Denis O'Brien in Davos. Won't tell anybody what was discussed at that. Stephen Ray, the group chief editor of INM, is appointed to an EU board to tackle fake news. And in the background to this, the government launched a 2040 plan, and they put ads in papers without marking them as advertorial content. Now, I'm not going to allege conspiracy, but if you're looking in from the top and you're looking down on that, you would draw your own conclusions.
Yeah, and what it doesn't do is, it doesn't do any favours for good people who could be put through a system and will come out the other side of it. And may well be somebody from INM.
Yeah.
May well be somebody like David Begg. But, and it's exactly the same when you look at judicial appointments. Having a robust process actually protects good people. And if they're good enough to do the job, they'll come out through a robust system.
Am I right in saying, though, when you guys in the Social Democrats have a corruption bill that you're...
What we have is, we developed we had a look at around at other countries, how they actually did things, and we were very impressed with different models. The one that we actually settled on was the one in Queensland in Australia, and it is an anti-corruption agency. We think that what we have is we've a terrible tendency to do things after the fact here, like tribunals and inquiries and things like that. We've spent over €500 million up to now on tribunals and inquiries, and there's something like 14 of them still underway. We're not catching things in real time. It's going to cost you one way or the other, but in actual fact there's a cost that you can't count. It's an intangible cost, and that is public confidence by not doing this. So we believe that you need to have a very large anti-corruption agency that actually ties in elements like, for example, the Office of Corporate Enforcement, like the Standards in Public Office. Instead of having fragmented bits all over the place, that you have one consolidated agency where you can have a degree of expertise, like forensic accountants, like lawyers, that you can move around that organisation as you need to, but you have in-house expertise. In actual fact, it would do an awful lot in terms of our reputation, and we were all worried about our reputation when we crashed. I think there's a lot of reputational damage done by virtue of the fact that we have, we've constant things going on, and like even this INM thing, that's not going to go unnoticed.
No, I know the international press has picked up on that. I've had conversations with MPs in the UK who use the fence-sitting term of, that's very interesting. And when you see that type of stuff, you realise that people, they know what's happening. But I think it's interesting to make the point in terms of standards in public office. You make the point in terms of the Office of Corporate Enforcement. We're also famously known that I think it was more Gardaí arrested Paul Murphy on the morning than they had forensic accountants in the entire Office of Corporate Enforcement. That's a statistic that actually should be embarrassing.
Having said that, I've got to say that I'm quite impressed with this.
Oh, I'm talking 18 months ago.
I'm quite impressed with the with the efforts that have been made with ODCE.
I think there's a real sea change, maybe, and I'm hoping, I'm keeping my fingers crossed that there's a sea change, because we are very good, as you said, of setting up these little pieces and giving them remits, but no power to follow through on what they have to do.
Yeah, but I think that some of our problems go back to, it's kind of post-colonial kind of thing. We have no memory of building institutions. And what we did was we inherited institutions that don't necessarily fit with our culture. And essentially, we're not good at designing new institutions for ourselves. Like, we have, one of our greatest strengths is our informality, but it's also one of our greatest weaknesses. What we need is we need to put in structures where they're needed, but we also need to have design institutions, like, for example, our local government system, that isn't about churning letters out saying, no, you can't have that, but working with the informality of our community organisations.
Well, what you were saying about, we wait until after the fact and then there's a tribunal or an investigation. Yet that's not the model we use for the ordinary citizen. That we use that on a corruption level. We'll have a big tribunal afterwards, and if somebody's done something wrong, it'll be 20 years down the road, nobody cares. And that's the way they use that. But we're actually, on my drive in here today, for the citizen, we're in quite an Orwellian space at the moment. As you're driving in, the first thing I hear is one of the rules of living in Ireland is that you have a TV licence. Now, they're not saying one of the rules you have living in Ireland is that you conduct your business correctly, but they can do it when they want to.
Yeah.
And it's very Orwellian. It's a constant message that's coming through your radio. Pay your TV license. Or when water was there, it was this constant barrage of
now, I'm
warnings.
very happy to pay a television license. I want good public service broadcasting, but I'm happy to pay it. But it was when you just remind me of I'm on the Public Accounts Committee, and we had done quite a bit last year with the guards, as you know, with the Temple Moor featured very heavily. And one of the things that kept on jumping out at me was, this is the headquarters. This is where you actually set the standards. This is where you train people.
Yeah.
And essentially, there was non-compliance by the guards with the standards in public office. Yes. There was not, and there was a very,
accounting irregularities.
It was like, it was like, and I was saying to myself, it's no wonder in actual fact that we don't take the whole white collar area of crime seriously, because it doesn't really loom large in the place where you train the people who would have a responsibility for it.
Clearly not. When you consider that guys were allowed collude on their statements in terms of the Anglo trial, they were allowed 25 times to amend their statements, and they were actually allowed to compare and contrast what they were saying. It should never have even gone as long as it did as a trial. The judge should have said this evidence cannot be used in a court of law because it's purely being contrived. Yeah. And that was actually done by the oversight of the Gardaí who were out of their depth and that weren't trained in white collar crime, and they accommodated this through bloody willful ignorance or just incompetence. And I don't want to personalise it, but that trial was just 35 million or whatever it was burnt.
Which one are you talking about? Because there was two.
Yeah.
And the idea that, that it was obvious on the first one, and what was the point in
shouldn't have
going
carried on
the second time? And it must be enormously frustrating for people who really want to do the right thing and don't have the resources. And I know that there were requests for resources, and when you kind of examined that, Roisin Shortall, my colleague, she had asked a series of questions on that about just exactly what was requested by the ODCE in terms of resources and when were they provided. And there was a significant time lag,
But that's something that has gone on for 80 years in this country is, we have a problem, but we don't really want to examine it, so we'll set up some sort of forum and no teeth.
In many ways, it's done to deflect the immediate. And we're letting ourselves down by that. See, my glass is definitely half full. I actually think this is a great country. I think it just could be, I've said it so often that I think we're a great country despite our politics. We have to be a good country because of it. And so you have to be very deliberate in what you go out and look for. I mean, I don't think we have to have a housing crisis. I was calling that out in 2014.
Yeah.
I don't think you leave it to the market. I think there are things that are public goods. Perfectly happy for people to buy houses if they have the money to buy them. I've done that myself. But you do have to look at you have to look at things in an entirely different way. Like, it's not about property, it's about somebody's home.
Yes.
And if you have a different concept in how you actually want this country to, to work, you have a chance. The problem is that we're using the same old spent solutions that got us into trouble to get us back out.
The answer to capitalism wasn't hyper-capitalism. And what we've had now is, unfortunately, we had Orla Hegarty say to us on the pod that she thinks people want to rewind the tape back to 2002. That was 5 years before the crash when things were good. Let's get back to that. And they're saying, well, why would we rewind the clock nearly 20 years now at this stage and not expect better? Why would we not be more ambitious than let's go back?
That was 3 years before I was elected to the Dáil, and I was elected to the Dáil on a by-election. And I remember being profoundly depressed around that time because it was all this L'Oreal and it was all this individualism and it was all about property and ownership and you were looking at the collective, you know, and you were saying we're missing so many great opportunities. Here we have resources for the first time. You have an intact population. People have their children don't have to emigrate. This is wonderful, and we're squandering the opportunity to do things in solidarity.
It was kind of like late stage Thatcherism. You know, it was kind of like a late stage.
But you're right. It was consumerism and it was individualism, and even when it was that, it was about. You know, we can have a laugh about it, but you only have to remember at that time, I think the biggest book at the time was probably David McWilliams' Pope's Children. It was all about the Decklanders and the people who wanted these bits.
And the breakfast
roll man.
And they were all living in my area because we're known as the commuter belt area, and people get very upset, and very understandably so, at being described as some sort of an economic unit, that they're just a commuter, where in actual fact they want to live their lives in a very full way. And I think that the crash has taught people that, but what I think is really upsetting is that the kind of country we're going to build is a replica of what caused the problem. And I think that there's an awful lot of people that are much more ambitious for this country. It's pretty difficult to build the kind of political organisation that will be a vehicle to do that. Just haven't
tried,
dipped our toe in the water, and we're constantly trying to, you know, build the architecture, and then you know,
it's terribly hard to break in the Irish political system. It's very, very difficult. As an individual, it's difficult. As a party, it's practically impossible. And you're fighting the politics of fear all the time. People are afraid not to vote for Gummy Bear 1 or Gummy Bear 2 that are sitting up there, the same idiots year in, year out. And they're sold this message. Oh, God, you can't vote for anybody. Oh, you can't vote for them. You can't vote for them. But the guys who are up there have been so incompetent for 80 plus years, so abjectly. And the corruption organisation is a fine example. Corruption is a massive problem in Ireland. Yet for 80 years, there is no single agency that will deal with corruption. That in itself is corruption. That's an institutionalised corruption.
Yeah, it's just it's just about doing enough just to survive.
5 years.
You see, I mean, I can understand the early years of the state where there was, you know, certainly in the 20s and the early 30s, where, I mean, you were, you know, there was a degree of trying to stabilise after a very difficult era. And my own grandparents were involved in the 1916 Rising, and my grandfather was interned in Frangrock, and they had great hopes for an Irish constitution. And, you know, they would have really been influenced by the cultural revival. That would have been really the kind of the dominant thing, if you like, and an Irish identity and that kind of stuff. And I understand how difficult the 20s and 30s were, and how strapped for cash we were. Funny, at the same time, the 1930s was a big building. But I think in many ways, what started off as quite good, when you look at the like Board and Amon, you look at the ESB, you look at some of the things that were done in the early years, you can't say it was 80 years of inactivity. There was some very good things done early on. But I think it really kind of, where people kind of, and the area of protectionism and, you know, trade wars and things like that, and we've got to remember there was a world war in between. I think the Lamass era changed things, but some of it wasn't changed for the better. And it really was about the mohair suits. It was about loyalty. And one of I think the core things about Fianna Fáil is, and I've watched it over the years, loyalty plays a big part in their organisation. The problem is that the loyalty stopped being about their individual members, and the loyalty started being about their funders.
Yes.
And I think that was very corrosive. And Fianna Fáil have been chameleons in terms of, like, they were Liberal Democrats when it was the PDs, and now they're Social Democrats. I don't trust that. Well, they say they're social democracy, but there's bits of what they do are social democracy, and I'm very pleased to see some of that. I think it's a better approach, but they, if the fashion changes,
well, I think
will it change again?
I think both Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are so long in politics that they are chameleons. Both of them are chameleons. You have to be
power.
You have to be to
the
stay
pursuit
there.
of power. It's the pursuit of power,
But you have to be to stay there. The world has changed immensely from when they've first established, and yet they're still in power. I mean, there's very few other countries within the EU where the same parties exist.
Well, I've got to say, you give it to them. They've been phenomenally successful, but have they been phenomenally successful for themselves?
Yes, for themselves, completely.
And that's always a conflict in terms of. I mean, I'd love to be in government, but for the right reasons, and with a government pointing in the right direction.
The numbers are almost there, though, Catherine. The numbers are almost there for a proper left-right divide.
I don't think you can exclusively count numbers, and I don't think you can count the left as one kind of group. Yeah. I don't think you can. I mean, I was the whip for the technical group in the last job, and you can see, well, of course that was quite a diverse group, but you can see that there's conflicts between different elements of the left. I mean, I don't believe a command economy works. I don't, and what I describe as a command economy is that, okay, you've 4.5 million people, you decide they all need a pair of shoes, so you go and get a factory to, make 4.5 million pairs of shoes. That's not how it works. You do require markets to be there for certain functions.
iPencil.
And, you do require markets to be there. But what you've got to do is you've got to tame those markets. You've got to decide what are public goods. Like, I think our heritage is a public good. It's worth investing in. I think our healthcare is a public good. It's not something that you should have to have a checkbook to decide, whether or not you get a hip replacement and you're taking out pain. I think education is a public good. I don't think owning hotels is,
No, it's not particularly a public good.
No, but I think we've got to decide what are the public goods and what do we require to invest in. I think, compliance, anti-corruption is a public good. You invest in it, or if you don't invest in it, what happens is you pay for it later on, but you pay for it in ways that is more than monetary.
What we lack, and what we've continued to lack at all stages throughout the history of the state, whether it be through incremental changes that have been good or changes that have actually affected people badly, is accountability. There's always a deficit of accountability. We can always identify the problem, but we're murder for actually...
We can and we can't, because you can't have accountability without transparency.
Yes.
And I think you have to talk about both of them at the same time, and you have to have sight of things so as you can put in systems of accountability. But then we've accountability in theory, like, for example, separation of powers between the like of the guards and the Department of Justice,
which we've
just seen. And you've just seen that tweet.
He was texting him to say, "Great job done."
I mean, so those kind of things give you an insight into the workings of, and what we've got to do is you put the accountability in, and we've said it. There's got to be consequences for senior civil servants, as well as there is for as well as there is for anyone else. But
look at the OECD report that I always go back to. Martin knows this is one of my favourites that confirmed Ireland as a tax haven. The government stood up and said we've gotten the highest rate ranking of so we're really tax compliant. But if you read the report, what it actually said is we're the most transparent tax haven in the world. Actually, we're the best in the world. And that's a feather in the cap of the revenue commissioners, because they're moving the money through Ireland, and they're moving it in a transparent tax avoidance, legal tax avoidance scheme. Now, if they can create accountability that it shows that this can be done, whether we think it's an ethical or moral, the right thing to do, that's a whole other argument. But the revenue have done nothing in the eyes of the laws of the state. Where we lack then is when you turn to other departments, the Department of Justice or Department of Health, which make, which make people go through huge ordeals. We've had Gareth Noble here, human rights lawyer, and he's talking about going through months and months and months of litigation, mediation, until they get to the steps of the courthouse and they're about to open the door, and finally the hand goes on the shoulder and says, "Yeah, we did wrong." This is where I think it's one of your Twitter handles you use all the time. We're better than this.
Yeah,
we need to be better than this.
Yeah, and we all know we're better than this. And like, it's a very frustrating country from that point of view, because I think there's an awful lot of people who know we can do better. And like the revenue commissioners, when we've had them into the Public Accounts Commission on a number of occasions, they act according to the laws that are set for them. It's not their fault. Essentially, they don't set policy. And I've got to say, if we've got our act right in any of the various agencies of the state, I think the revenue commissioners is dramatically better than it was years ago.
It is, yeah.
Dramatically better and more user friendly. Nobody really wants to engage with the revenue commissioner. Mind you, I've got to say, I don't mind paying tax. I want to see public services for the tax that I pay, but it's never bothered me. It's a privilege to be a taxpayer. That's the way I see it, because I actually think the state should be there. But at something recently, again at the Public Accounts Committee, we had somebody in, and I think it might have been the Department of Finance or deeper. And they were talking about Section 110s, which were used for vulture funds to avoid tax. It's the charitable status. And we were reminded by whoever the official from whatever department it was, we said, well, these were introduced in 1994 and they were never intended. They were never intended to raise revenue. It was the whole point of them was that this was to do with the IFSC and all of that kind of stuff, you know. And you're saying, I don't think that was quite understood, you know.
And down in the IFSC, they move more money than 10 times the Irish economy, and we look the other way. Now, whether we look the other way because that's what the law dictates, or we look the other way because that's part of our marketing to the world, that's another argument for another day. But it reminds me of what happened recently in the States, where someone used a Trump administrator used the Clean Water Act to give employees a pay rise because they weren't entitled to it, but he wanted to accommodate them. And he found the loophole. He got it. He gave them the pay rise, and it was all above board. And he had to resign, right? He had to resign. They said, yes, you did it. Yes, it was legal. Yes, it all ticks the boxes. But you got to go. You can't be doing this. And that's in the Trump administration, guys. We all think are all maniacs. But at least...
But the thing about it is that law enforcement in America is law enforcement.
Yes,
and
it is.
Having said that, I think, the idea that, 5% of the world's population and 25% of the prison population. And something like 1 in 6 men in America will have spent an overnight in prison. Or in a jail or whatever. I mean, I don't think that, I think there's aspects of it that I certainly wouldn't be following, but if there is, rules, they equally apply. We
saw Trump's attorney. I mean, can you imagine a politician's attorney in Ireland? Right? It just simply, no matter how low you are,
people presume it's not going to happen. And I remember knocking on doors the last election of the election before 2016. It might have been 2011, and it was remarkable how people were. It was nearly every door you were going to, people were saying the same thing, like the understanding the difference between local politics and national politics, and the importance of having that focus on the national thing so that we actually act in the public interest. And they were saying, we want our health service to work, we want our education system, we want, the banks were sort of the thing of the game changer and all that. That didn't happen. But we don't mind paying taxes, but we've no confidence that our taxes are going to go to the things
services,
and they're going to deliver things like, for example, housing or where it's required, health education or whatever. And the thing about it is that this government is not working if you use that criteria, and I've no confidence in it doing anything to change.
And I think it was Cormac McCarthy argued. I remember having an argument myself with one or two economists saying that the best budget we should have had the last 2 years would have been a no budget. We should have kept to the guardrails, spending on as you say, health. We didn't need a €5 a month tax break to try and placate people, when the reality of the situation is, the greater good is we've gone from 1,752 people homeless to nearly 10,000 people homeless. We've created a trolley crisis. We've got a lack of skills being built now. We're looking at,
people have to see outcomes.
Yes.
And they've got to see outcomes. Like people are prepared, by and large, and they're prepared if for example, they didn't feel that they were obliged to have health insurance. I know old age pensioners are trying to maintain a health insurance.
trying to pay it. Yeah.
And if they thought that they could rely on not getting that €5 in an increase in the pension, but that they could be sure that when they're sick they can go to hospital, and that they were going to be cared for. I think people would buy that. I think if people thought that we were serious about, for example, childcare, which is some of the most expensive childcare in the Western world, if they thought that they could rely on getting a childcare when they require it, and that they could afford to live, essentially, I think that they would value what they get for their taxes. Our problem is that on the other side of it, we're not doing the kind of thing that builds up people's confidence. And I believe we can do it if we collectively put our minds to it, that public services have to mean public services that people can rely on. Not just, and they're there for the average person, they're there for people when they need it. It's universal. It's not, in some way, for people who can't afford it.
I think it was very telling that when Leo Varadkar went for his leadership of Fine Gael, that the stick he used, his popularity stick, was to beat those on the bottom rung of the ladder. Social welfare, cheat us all. And yet, and you know this, Catherine, I've been banging this drum for a very long time, there's far more defrauded through bogus self-employment than there is through claimant fraud. And yet, there's no, I'm on my way to trying to get into the Public Accounts Committee to say, why won't you investigate this social welfare fraud? Jean Kerrigan wrote about it a couple of weeks ago and said, yeah, there is millionaires building houses on stolen PRSI, but that doesn't sell with the Fine Gael people who want to hear it's all the poor people's fault.
I think that was I think that particular campaign was quite cynical, because the timing of it was very much in line with a Fine Gael leadership election campaign. And essentially, it was not so much speaking to the general populace,
to their own
voters. And we had an official from the Department of Social Protection in, again at the Public Accounts Committee, who said, and I'm paraphrasing, that they didn't think that campaign was a good idea. It was
a small apology almost issue that it was ever run. Yeah. And that's how, and if anybody can read the quotes, they're available online. It was more or less we made a mistake here, hands up, we should never have run that campaign. And we go then to the mindset. Because the mindset for me is when we talk about unions are looking for pay restoration and the government are arguing for we're in recovery. And I keep thinking of restoration and recovery. They mean the same thing. Let's go backwards. They don't mean about being more ambitious, as you've put it. It's about they want to go, let's get back to what we had. And what we had actually caused the chaos in the beginning. Yeah, but one of the things just to kind of pick up again, the point in, and it keeps coming up, is the relationship between, you talked about it earlier in relation to the National Development Plan, and we talked about it in relation to the Department of Justice and the Guards. The thing about it is that your civil service is supposed to be there not to carry things out for political purposes. The
The civil service is supposed to be there to actually act as there's supposed to be a tension between the civil service and politics. And what we're seeing the absence of that. That's why we actually require to reform our institutions, so as that we actually go back to. We'll never get good public services if we don't have that tension.
I don't know if you want to go. I don't know. See, going back, it infers to me that it worked at some stage. I think you need to say what you did with the corruption bill. You looked at the best practices around the world, and you take that and you just say, there's our template, and we're going to work from that. We're not going to go back to another template. We're literally going to go from this as our new baseline. This is the new baseline here. And you know what? Whether that be, as me and Martin always say, conflict with a small c, you know, you need to have that, because without change, without actual dissent, you need some dissent.
Yeah. In actual fact, I think dissent is quite good.
It's healthy.
And you get nothing without upsetting things a little
throwing
bit.
a few chairs and knocking over a table.
No, there is an element to that, you know, and what we need a much more active citizenry. You've only something like 2% of people that are politically engaged at any time, and a lot of that disappears between election. We actually need people to be way more active and to be, you know, I want, you know, demanding of public services and understanding what good public services are. But you're right, we were looking at best practice in other countries. Like, for example, a good idea from New Zealand in relation to electoral commission. Really good idea in Australia in relation to the anti-corruption agency. There's others in other places, but that was the one we felt was the best fit. Looking at things like, for example, the Nordic country. Well, how did the Nordic countries end up getting a lot of foreign direct investment, and at the same time have good public services and not
12% tax rate?
Yeah, and not only that, but have a very engaged population. We were looking at how these worked in other countries, and you see, there's an awful lot of Irish people who have had experiences in other parts of the world and can see how things work. I was recently in Berlin, for example, and you're looking at a public transport system. Let me talk about the word system. It's not a bit of this, and a bit of that, and a bit of the other, and well, let's try that and see does it work. Oh no, that didn't work. Whoops, that was a problem.
Well, even in the worst of times, we connected two Lewises.
Like, do you know what I mean? That if you're doing something, you look at all the bits and you put the system in place, and you know we're pretty good at doing things if we do it in an informal way. And I don't understand how we can't actually structure some of that informality into delivering public services. Not that we haven't got the intelligence, the ability. Look, we built half America, we built half of Britain. Do you know, I mean, it's
like there's a dumb thing when you come back into Ireland. You have to step back into dumb, that we can't join, and we say it a lot, join the dots. You join the dots on what's causing the problems, what's creating the situations, and you take away those, you shave off all the edges until you get to the problem. In Ireland, you walk back in here, and people who know better do worse.
But right from the word go, we had vested interests, controlling things.
Oh yeah,
and that was how we and whether those vested interests were, you know, where we handed over responsibility for education to religious organisations or our healthcare system or whatever. The state always abdicated the responsibility.
We still do.
And require actually to realise that that's part of the problem.
There needs to be an honesty about this, because when you hear Owen Murphy talk about Peter McVerry Trust as our partners, as our service delivery partners, that's terrifying.
It is, yeah.
Because
that should be additional.
And why does nobody ever stand up and say, you cannot call the actual firefighter your service delivery?
Yeah.
He's the emergency fireman, right? So you cannot, because that's what it is. It's Peter McVerry is literally got his finger in the dike, and you're coming up and you say, oh yeah, he's grand, he's got a finger in the dike.
It's nearly even worse than that, because what you do is you almost trap those organisations that should have kind of create a dialectic there, where you have that tension, where they're
adversarial,
and essentially they require to have that freedom, so that they can call government out. When you start creating them as partners, in many ways, social partnership is a model for that. When you start doing that, you take away that critical side of things that you're required to have in a functioning democracy. And they become in turn dependent on the resources from the state to do the firefighting.
We know that happened where they said you can't release figures or we won't be releasing funds. They told them as our partners, you've seen all these people on the streets, so don't be telling that to the media or we withhold this month's.
There is a post-colonial psyche in Ireland where we be grateful for what you get, no matter what it is you get, and particularly when you say FDI. When FDI comes in here, we're told, we've the best, the story that's fed to us is they're here because we're well educated, we're mobile, we're clever people. They're here because they're getting tax breaks.
I don't think it's exclusively that.
It's not, Martin.
I don't think it's exclusively that, and I think that there is, I think there are things that, there are things that actually encourage them.
We're a gateway to Europe.
Yeah.
We speak English.
Yeah.
We're we do have, for the most part, an educated workforce. We have...
the tax is certainly a component. And
it helps that we're terribly subservient.
Yeah. No, what the real problem we have, and here's the problem that never gets called out, that I see. We have 147,000 jobs in these FDI. You pick these 12 companies up and you say there's 147,000 jobs there. We're delivering 640 billion worth of sales value floating through their accounts. You pick the same 12 companies up and you drop them in Germany. They have, I think it's 440,000 jobs, but they're only putting through 220 billion because of transfer pricing. That's the difference. We don't get the jobs for the value for the actual tax break we give. So if we were to actually have a real conversation with Zuckerberg and say to him, listen, mate, we see what you're doing. We're okay with it, but you need to bump up the job numbers.
But it's also pretty dangerous in terms of all the eggs in one basket.
Yes.
And we need to build a strong indigenous sector.
Very true.
And we need to recognise what that requires. We need good quality infrastructure. We need the costs of things like, for example, housing, things like congestion. All of those things actually are impediments.
Yes.
And look, it's going to take time to have that changeover. But I think that there is a realization that we have an overdependence on the foreign direct investment sector, if you like, the multinational sector. But I think that there is also there's an affinity with Ireland in relation to, and that is, I was very surprised, for example, did a piece of work in the last genealogy is my area of where I enjoy that.
Hobby.
It's my hobby. My hobby. I've been putting together pieces of my background for decades now, and I did a piece of work where we got a document then published on the committee I was on, and I would have been involved as in doing that piece of work. And what was amazing was the level of affinity there was for Ireland. That word affinity kept on coming up. So we do have an emotional connection. And I think in addition to the speaking English, our location, all that does have a bearing. But I think if we think that we're going to in the way we have
it's a bit it's slapdash, and we've gotten away with it.
It's not only slapdash, we're found out.
Yeah.
We're found out, and we better realise that we quickly have to change things. But in quickly changing things, we need to be looking at our indigenous sector, because we need a strong economy if we're going to have the funds to invest in public services. And that requires people to pay taxes, and that includes that sector as well.
Coming back to the political climate, do you think we're going to have an election this year, Kath?
Yeah. When
do you put it down for? Pre-budget, post-budget?
I think it'll be post-budget.
Okay.
That would be my instinct on it at this stage. And I'm not sure what an election, the context of an election is very often what sets the tone. if there's going to be falling out between, like at the moment, for example, when you look at the numbers, Fianna Fáil hold the balance of power.
Yes.
It's not the Independent Alliance. It's Fianna Fáil that hold the balance of power. And there's a resentment between Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. And I think that there is almost a sense of entitlement by this government. That's the word I would use. The sense of entitlement that they've taken the responsibility to be the government, and that's going to be quite difficult to have as a backdrop. Actually, that might work pretty well.
Well, I think with this government that we have, we're heading into an election period where we have housing, and those of us who care about housing care very deeply about housing, but that's not what's the fight going to be between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. They don't really have an issue to fight about. They just know that this thing has reached as far as it can go.
It's a slow bike race to a falling out at the moment, and we know that. And
but they're searching for that issue. Fianna Fáil are looking for that issue that gets them out.
They'll have plenty of issues. That's not going to be a problem. The problem, once they get post budget, it's over. It's run its course, and they're going to say it's over, and they're going to have a crack at it and see if Fianna Fáil can return to their natural place in power. Okay, is Micheál Martin going to be the first ever Fianna Fáil leader to not be Taoiseach? And that's this big legacy thing that's going on there in the background. What we need to concern ourselves about more, I think, is there a way to build from, make sure that instead of actually Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael coming back at 60% of the vote, can we chip away at that? Can we bring that down?
No, they're not 60, and we might.
But that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, Martin. You need to actually make sure that we put forward an alternative. I know things like Right to Change. I know things like you're building a party from the grassroots up. We need to make sure that people can actually think that there's alternatives. Yeah. And you're very right. You hit on you need to say people. Step out of the individual and see, do you want a greater? Someone said to me last week, "Well, your house is, how much would you get for it now? You must be that would be a great, And I said, no, I'd rather my kids be able to afford a house actually, because I don't know how they could afford to live where I'm living right now in average industrial wage.
Actually, it's amazing the number of people that are not. It's not very often. It's people who are not directly impacted, but they are worried about their children. Or worried about siblings, whatever. But the next election, I think, is, and there's all sorts of resentments going on at the moment. Fine Gael resent the fact that Fianna Fáil hold the balance of power. Fianna Fáil resent the fact that they should be ministers. There's all that kind of stuff. You can what we don't want is a presidential style election where people are offered, you can have a Fianna Fáil led coalition or Fine Gael led coalition, and there's no other choice.
That would be a terrible stagnation of politics. I mean, I know it's stagnant, but that would be an awful stagnation.
Well, that's what happened in 2007. 2007, people voted with their pockets. We better keep the show on the road. Things are a bit, we may well have a property bubble, all that kind of stuff. And what happened was, there was 3 winners in that election. There was Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and Bertie Ahern. There were 3 winners. Yeah. And everyone else got hammered. And essentially, that if you want just, same as you had before, the old Einstein thing comes in.
Doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result.
Unless having said that, I don't think this very fragmented Dáil has been. There's been good things that have happened in it, but I think people they're being sold a message that you need stability.
And I think it goes back into the I'm going to use a word here, my word collusion, whereby you have things that are happening in the Dáil that are actually on the side of the opposition, that are actually changing. Government are losing votes, they're losing bills, we're stopping fracking, we're doing things like this that are. but it doesn't seep out in through a lot of media sources, because what we get then is, well, there's going to be an interconnector between Cork and Limerick, and and we get sold your man standing in front of a llama, but like there is a disconnect there between what the public do, and you're right, they're not politically engaged. We don't have, Trump has been wonderful because he's engaged. He's woken up in a whole portion of America that didn't vote in the last election. They've lost elections since Trump got in places. They've never lost elections because he said, we got to get out and vote. We can't get the House back. We can't win. There's no polls being published in a lot of British newspapers, particularly Murdoch newspapers at the moment. They've stopped putting the polls because no Labour have pulled ahead, and it terrifies them that Corbyn is actually, and the more they give out about him. I think I saw an article where someone went through 17 pages of one newspaper, and on every page there was an anti-Corbyn story. It's not working. It's not getting through. Things like social media are actually activating people. Things like podcasts are helping get voices out there, like having these conversations. We do need that, we need a spark.
And the Social Democrats going to stand more candidates this time than ever before, and I see you rolling out candidates pretty much everywhere.
Yeah, we're certainly going to contest a majority of constituencies.
Yeah.
And the big issue is cash.
Yeah, of course.
And the thing about it is, where you do get state funding to employ staff, you're not obviously permitted, and rightly so, to use state funding for, for electoral purposes. But cash is a big impediment. It's a big impediment to building alternatives, and to build something from scratch is pretty difficult. But we realise that we have to offer people the alternative, and again, it's a big deal for people to put themselves forward as a candidate, where you're asking them to, kind of fund their own campaigns as well, or part fund their own campaigns,
or swallow the time and.
Yeah. And are you ready to rock now? If they call it tomorrow, you're ready to go.
Well, we have we have our emergency plan in place.
Okay. It's been in place for about 6 months.
If we have another 6 months, we will use that 6 months. We've been working we've been working on policy development and candidate selection. That we're also keeping an eye to the local elections next year, because I think the local elections are shouldn't be dismissing their importance.
Will we get to the locals before a general?
I think we'll have a general before the locals. That would be my instinct on it.
Okay. And how are you finding, we'll say, the media at the moment for getting message out there, for getting profile, for getting party members? Are you finding this a more and more a closed shop as time goes on?
Well, you see, the thing about it is that the media will want, because they'll get criticism from parties that are established and they have plenty of people to offer.
Yeah.
It can be very hit and miss, they tend to want elected people, and that's the challenge when you're trying to,
We'll miss the old Vincent Brown around there. That was I mean, no matter what you think of it, that was parish hall politics at its absolute best.
Well, I think he engaged people who were never engaged in politics before, because I know by the people who talked to me about, and during the time, I would have been on it quite a bit. I haven't been on this one, I've been on it once. I may not be their most popular.
It's more. It's just on at the wrong time.
I'm thinking of changing my name to Damien English and just waiting on my phone to ring.
If they changed the time to 12 o'clock and just said it's 12 o'clock midday and just said, look, it's a lightweight magazine program, it'd be more honest, But I think we're going to miss that where Vincent went around every constituency. Yeah. It was a great eye opener.
It was, and fair play to him, and fair play to the organisation because that was a tall order, because the resources that were required. And I watched every one of those. I must be off me rocker, but I watched every one of those. And the funny thing was that it wasn't the things you expected to come up. Like mental health came up in every one. There was suicide. There were things, and you were seeing people hurting. I thought it was a real eye into each community.
Middle Ireland,
and I got to say, most of us, none of us were looking forward to our turn.
Nobody got an easy ride, but everybody got a fair ride, and that was okay. So I think that's going to be missing if we're going to go back to this presidential style thing where it's not policy, it's all,
Like the face on the poster.
Oh, God, it's awful.
But that needs to be avoided. We need to, God, I'm going to sound like I'm, but we need to actually understand when we see it's the face on the poster, you have to be able to say that. You have to be able to say that as an opposition. You have to say to, are you going to vote in the presidential election or do you believe in democracy?
You see, the thing is, we probably have a presidential election anyway.
Yeah.
So the thing about it is, if we have a presidential election, let that be the presidential election.
Yeah.
The general election doesn't have to be that.
Actually, when you think of it, we have possible general, locals, and presidential all coming up in a relatively short space of time.
The good news is
European election.
I'm delighted. Politics has gone. It's been boring. I'm delighted.
Well, Martin, the good news is as well that I think where you need to gather support is when, and I'm going to be confident again, and when repeal passes, you will have got a more politically engaged electorate there that you can tap into there and say, listen, that you can make a positive change. That shows you that, people getting together, crowdfunding 400,000 in 24 hours, you can make a positive change. And if you can do that on social media.
Yeah, I think you've got to make people realise that actually together. I've been saying for the last few years, we need we in politics, not I. And that's what the early noughties were. It was all about I, the individual, but when we start acting together, and we see it all the time, and that's why I'm so confident about this country. We see it just a bit of snow. The whole community comes out. They're looking after each other. They're shoveling the snow. They're helping each other out. If it's another crisis, they'll do the same. If it was the Special Olympics, we pull together. No matter what it is, we're genius at this community thing.
Yeah.
What we need to do is we need to actually take those values and put those values into our political systems, so as that we actually do things as a collective, as we. And I actually think that we're more than capable of doing that. We do have to call out the vested interests if we're going to be able to do that, so as that people feel confident that we can actually see an outcome for the energy that goes into it.
Well, thank you very much for coming in to meet us, Catherine. It's been great. We've been waiting on this a while, and it's lovely to have you in here. And I think it's kind of timely because we do have all these we have the presidential, we have the locals, and we probably have a general coming up. So it's timely to say we're back in political mode now, and we're going to be back in political mode maybe going on the goods of 2 years. We're going to have stuff. So people want to start getting their head around it, want to start looking at the options and start weighing up the options. It's not about socks, it's not about llamas, and it's not about the face. Forget the face on the poster. What's behind the face? That's where we're at now.
Yeah, and there are options.
Yes. There are. They're very valid, other options. At this stage, please, everybody, stop being afraid to vote against Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. The world will not fall down. We will continue.
I think it's been great to have this conversation. It's nice to sit down with you. It's lovely to spend some time, but more importantly, I think we do need to have a focus on energizing people to show that they can make a difference. Absolutely, I think that's a great idea. And thank you so much.
Okay, it's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening, folks. Remember, please hit subscribe, leave us a review, tell your friends. Independent, listener-led content matters. You can get all our previous episodes on our website, echochamberpod.com, or you can send me an email to theechochamberpod@gmail.com. Thanks, folks.